I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is Alex Benish again with another freewheeling discussion. And I had a very intelligent reader, maybe more than one because I didn't go through all my emails. Um, Intelligent reader respond to our conversations, and it's a reader that really enjoys Alex's work and enjoys this analysis of the Roman Empire being a big model, for everything. And he kind of he raised this issue of, well, you don't talk about class, you don't seem to talk about this. And I actually do, but when you go to graduate school and you get Marxism rammed down your throat, you don't want to talk about it because you've heard more about it than you'll ever hear. And he made a comment that I have to comment on, which is, well, you do know that, the modern communist governments, Marx and Lenin would never recognize these people as real communists. And because they're really aristocrats running their own, they're an elite, as if Marxism was egalitarianism. Marx, I think Slavoj Žižek made this point in his debate with Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson said that Marxism was egalitarianism, and Slavoj Žižek corrected him and said, "Oh no, Marx never ever advocated egalitarianism. He said each according to his ability, each according to his need. That's not egalitarianism." In fact, as Lenin went on, it was very clearly elite-oriented. The vanguard of you had to have organized communist parties to win. Lenin taught, to make Marxism work, you have to have this, which means you have to have an elite, which means it's not democratic, it's oligarchic. And in fact, Lenin signed his name, Vladimir Ulyanov, his real name, aristocrat. And if you read Marx's biography, Karl Marx had a profound obsession and admiration for aristocrats because he wanted to make his own aristocracy, a red one. But that's what he wanted. So, but that is my, part of my response. And of course, he wanted to know about Chi Hao-qian, the secret speech of the Chinese general who said they wanted to exterminate Americans and make a second China in the lower 48 states. And how do I know that's valid? And what I would say is, look, I thought it was too good to be true, a fraud, when I first heard about the secret speech of Chi Hao-qian, until I went and actually read it and found that it corresponded with defector testimony of Colonel Stanislav Lunev, who spoke Mandarin, worked in China, worked in the U.S., and said that he was present when the Russian generals made an agreement with the Chinese generals and worked it out through 1991 and 92. And he was at a meeting where it was the last meeting of the Russian general staff that he attended in early 92. And they said, look, the Soviet Union's gone, the Cold War is over, but we're still going to have a future war against America. And China is going to invade the lower 48 states. We are going to invade Alaska and parts of Canada, and they're going to keep the we've divided all the land up for this future war. And when I saw Chi Hao-qian's speech, I saw the elements of Lunev's testimony in the speech, which dumbfounded me. But then, of course, how do you prove it's real? Well, I knew a military intelligence colonel who introduced me to one of the Pentagon colonels, one on the team, who translated Chi Hao-qian's speech and actually did the work of determining it really was his. And how they did it was, Mandarin is a unique language. Your use of the words is like a fingerprint. And it was definitely Chi Hao-qian's speech. He wrote it himself. It had the same pattern as his other speeches. So I just thought I'd answer that to begin with. And so about class and the Marxists being class, I also quoted him Robert Michels, who wrote the famous book Political Parties, and it was the iron law of oligarchy. All political systems are oligarchic. There is no egalitarian utopia means nowhere, actually. There is no egalitarian world. We will never be equal politically. We never have been, and it's impossible. So it's like talking about the Tooth Fairy or the Easter Bunny, and I don't believe in those, and I don't really want to talk about them. So that's why I don't really mention class much, except that it's real.
But if you have looked at history, thousands of years of history, and if you have never found this mythical, you've never seen this mythical egalitarianism, obviously you don't consider it to be realistic. Now, I'm being very clear about this. I do not want to live in Roman times as a farmer. That was not fun, obviously. But even if you were somewhat more privileged, you were still required to perform military service. And if that worked out for you, in certain times you were given a plot of land and you could try to work your way up in society, but you still had the risk of military service, and that could end badly for you. So even in somewhat higher levels in society, it wasn't pretty. And even in the much higher ranks of Roman society, things could turn out really bad because the civil wars, the backstabbing, the intrigues, I mean, should be quite known to people that even as a Roman emperor, you could literally get stabbed in the back. And so every part of society had its unique challenges, and for a long time there was no other system that could be implemented in a realistic time frame. No other system that would be able to compete with these other traditional empires. And only when modern science came around and the printing and more people had more skills and knowledge, then we could start thinking about changing things and modernizing things. But of course, these ideas differed. And if you reduce complex society, if you reduce it to a degree where things become quite detached from reality, you end up with sort of this baseline socialist ideology. It's so far reduced, it doesn't really, it's really detached from reality. So
and all ideology really is detached from reality in the same sense.
If you reduce it that much and you think of it, well, we're just gonna have government government officials, and they make all these decisions and they divide everything up. It sounds good in theory, of course. And also when the Enlightenment happened, the socialists complained that Enlightenment wasn't good enough because Enlightenment did not make private property illegal, private ownership illegal. Only by declaring it illegal could you prevent a new upper class, a new ruling class, and all that. Now, if you reduce the reality so much, it may sound somewhat plausible, but things are way, way more complicated than this.
In political science, we call it the theory is reductionist, we say.
Exactly. And now today, when this person that commented on the video, if that person mentions the current state of, or the later stages of communist leadership, I mean, take, for example, current China. They have Roman problems. So right now they have this very powerful dictator, and it's and others in government, they want the power to be spread out more in the upper ranks. So it's the same problem that the Romans had. So in certain phases of the Roman Empire, it was believed by some, not by all, that you need a dictator for a time and to prevent or to end civil war. But they had the same kind of problems, and there was also this backstabbing. And so any real life communism cannot escape reality, and it cannot escape baseline principles which even the Romans had to deal with. So
yeah, and the same goes for this other strange word, democracy, which is often heard in tandem with socialism. You go back to Athens was the first city-state to spectacularly adopt a democratic system that turned into an empire. And it was before the Roman Empire, really. I mean, Rome was a republic at the time, but Athens had this amazing empire. But what Robert Michels wrote in Political Parties is that democracy is just a different way of organizing oligarchy because you're organizing. And organization implies, and so in Athens, what you get is you get Pericles. Pericles is this amazing figure in Athens, but you can't, there is no Athenian democracy without Pericles. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, this guy is what is he, a dictator? He's like this man with the magic mouth and the magic political touch that makes the Athenian democracy, and he makes the strategy of that democracy effective. And when he dies, sort of everything goes to seed. You know, it doesn't, they lose the what we now call the Peloponnesian War, which was just a series of wars between the democratic Athenian Empire with its fellow democratically organized city-states that were mainly on the sea, and you had Sparta, which was this oligarchical, you know, aristocratic military kind of state, and that they fought each other for decades off and on until Athens finally lost. And the thing is that we cannot escape the realities of empire, hierarchy, war. There's never going to be perpetual peace, you know.
Even in a small group, let's say a group of 100 people or 1,000 people, actual people, not just people on the internet. If you have an organization of that size, you have to figure things out. Who gets what position? Who is competent in this field? Who is more competent in that field? Who gets to decide what? Who gets paid what? Who makes the decisions? So this is one of the most essential things in human life, and you cannot pick some ideological cop-out way to answer this question. Now, the communists tried this, and the Nazis tried this. The National Socialists tried this. So your position was higher if you showed more allegiance and more loyalty, and you knew the right people. And this translated to, for example, horrendous problems in communist Chinese agriculture, where they messed up when they were growing rice, because they planted the seeds too close to each other, because they thought, according to communism, things need to be close together. And so they put ideology over science. And with the Nazis, if you were a member of the movement early, one of my ancestors, his name was Theo Benisch, he became quite important just because he was in the movement early, and he showed complete and utter complete agreement with the ideology. For a time, he even worked at Der Stürmer, the infamous newspaper, very anti-Semitic newspaper. He knew absolutely nothing about Jewish people. He knew absolutely nothing about this, alleged Jewish world conspiracy where these tiny families took over the British Empire, no questions asked, nobody, stopped them. He knew nothing about the British Empire. He knew nothing about these other empires. He was a mechanical engineer, like almost all the men in my family. He was capable of making precise things out of metal. That was his qualification, and all the members of the family, they were quite good at it, but he was in a completely different position, and that became, of course, a massive, monstrous problem. So,
and because he was a loyal National Socialist, and he was willing to repeat the ideology, he then was able to work for Der Stürmer.
Yeah, and he became the NSDAP regional chief, then the Bavaria chief, and then he was in the Reichstag. He has a Wikipedia entry, and I found some old postcards and photos of him, and he loved this stuff, but he was completely unqualified to make decisions and judge these things. And it's just, if you look at politics today, people judge each other based on how much they agree to a certain ideology, and this goes down to sentences and slogans. Now, in communism, they used specific phrases and terms. It was almost like an incantation. So in any official function, they had to use these terms, which showed agreement with the ideology. And you cannot judge people by those metrics. It's just a horrendous idea. And if the pressure mounts, if the economy is going downhill, if there's threat of internal war, if there's threat of external war, things have to function. This is just it's just the reality.
And so if you use the language of race and anti-Semitism, you then show that you're loyal to the party, that you belong to the group, to the ruling group. If you're in the Soviet Union and you use Marxist phrases and Lenin's formulas, that proves that you belong to the group, that you're a member of it. And so this is sort of how we form these ruling groups. And it's really kind of a distortion because, as you say, it's a simplification. But yet they carry forward their program, their strategy, and it actually becomes a form of madness after a while because the people actually believe their thinking, believe it's the truth, believe that it's effective because, after all, it gave me power. Yeah, I'm powerful, our party's powerful, therefore it must be the truth.
The Nazis actually made an architect. They took an architect, Albert Speer, and put him in charge of leading the war production effort. Why do you take a trained architect who's really good as an architect and put him in that position? Why do you make an idiot the head of the Navy? Why do you put these political guys in every these political guys? Why you put them in those positions?
Which idiot were you referring to? Rader?
No, the later guy, the
Dönitz?
Yeah, and so many others. They were just horrendously unqualified. Or head of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, the guy in charge
Hermann
of the
Göring.
Air Force.
Well, at least Göring could fly a plane.
It was so bad, and this pervaded all of the Nazi empire. This sort of how do you judge people and how do you assign certain positions?
Now, their loyalty.
Yeah, I mean, and let's see. I mean, the British, they did it a different way. They had this intricate system developed over centuries of forming bonds and aristocratic families and just judging them and figuring out how to pick the right person for the job, and even recruiting new people into this realm and finding new talent. So the British had this down to a T, but the Germans, they decided to learn from the Germans had decided to learn from the losers, not from the winners.
Explain that. What do you mean?
Well, if you look at other countries and you look at what works and what doesn't, I mean, you could have learned things from America, you could have learned things from the British, but they instead listened to people like, for example, the person in charge of Der Stürmer, so the actual editor-in-chief of this paper, Mr. Streicher.
Wasn't he actually Jewish? They found out in Nuremberg.
He was supposed to, his IQ was a tiny little bit above 100, and he was regarded as mentally unstable. And he was pushing ideology. He was in charge of teaching people how the world works. And so they were referring to older authors, and these authors were usually just completely unqualified. So they wanted to learn from these guys.
So they built on a foundation of garbage.
Yeah, and they based their foreign policy on that. The fake protocols of Zion. They based their whole concept of internal intelligence on that concept. So they thought killing Jews means counterintelligence, but of course there were traitors everywhere in the Nazi Empire, from all sorts of groups, and especially aristocratic people, and the Nazis trusted the aristocrats, but they thought, well, if they kill all the Jews, then the counterintelligence work was done. That was kind of the idea.
And of course, we have National Socialist regimes in the Middle East that use the protocols of the Elders of Zion to this day, and Muslim regimes and Arab regimes. You know, both Syria and it is a National Socialist regime. Iraq under Saddam Hussein was basically a National Socialist regime. And of course, you could say the same thing for Egypt in its actual foundations under Nasser. And of course, you look at Iran. So tell me, what do you know about, Hamas and Syria and Iran and their use of the protocols and the use of these same things the Third Reich used?
I mean,
and the communists, yeah.
Some of the things in the current war between Hamas and Israel, some of the things are very convoluted and super complicated, and it's basically this big this big chaos of espionage and different agendas, and it's very, very complicated even for people involved in this. So, but some things you can actually falsify. Some things are more baseline, and you can actually get to the bottom of it. And the foundational charter of Hamas is actually based on the fake protocols of Zion. So in Article 22, the charter of Hamas says that the protocols are real. Freemasons, Jews, and even the Rotary Club, they're working for the Zionists, and the Lions Club, they're working for the Zionists, and the Jews were responsible for the French Revolution, Western colonialism, communism, and the world wars. And so, yeah, this is basically what the Nazis believed, and based on that, the Nazis fell for deceptive maneuvers by the British, and the Nazis made some really, really weird foreign policy decisions, because the Nazis believed they could distinguish friend from foe. And some of these aristocrats, even the ones who were still living in Germany at the time, who were related to the British, some of these aristocrats for a long time had been involved in right-wing organizations, and they played the nationalist German card to make themselves seem credible. And in those right-wing circles, this idea became really fashionable, that tiniest Jewish families had somehow taken over the British Empire undisturbed. And the same nonsense is believed by Hamas. Now, by that logic, Hamas and others in the Islamic world, they probably believe by destroying Israel, they could behead the world conspiracy. And
they could create a better world, right? By doing that.
Well, beheading the world conspiracy by destroying Israel, and then destroying parts of America and Europe, and presto, you have destroyed the world conspiracy, and then the Islamists can happily take over the world, and something along those lines.
So when they see Washington, when they see London, they really see the Jews, their enemy, behind Washington, behind London. That's what they're really looking at. Yeah.
I mean, the Jews are responsible for Western colonialism, they say. Do they have? I mean, the history of empires, is that even familiar to them? I mean, empires more or less have worked the same and functioned the same for thousands of years. The Muslims came late to the party, and the Muslims actually learned from neighboring empires, the Persians and the surviving Eastern Roman Empire. Those neighbors were sort of an inspiration for the new Muslim empire. And as it always happened in the ancient world, even before that, an emerging smaller empire may actually recruit experts from older, bigger empires, experts in warfare, shipbuilding, all that kind of stuff. And there's some good studies on how the Muslims actually recruited experts from their neighboring countries and empires. Because you need those experts, it's not everybody's the same. It's not an egalitarian world. Some people are more valuable to an empire than others. And the results, I think, speak for themselves. So then you had the Soviet defector, Ion Mihai Pacepa. He was from Romania, the intelligence agency called the Securitate. He defected in 1978, and he gave us a bunch of really valuable information, and some of it concerns how the Soviets actually spread this conspiracy nonsense in the Muslim world. So Yuri Andropov, for example, he started a campaign, and up to the year 1978, the Soviets managed to recruit and train 4,000 agents of influence, recruit them from the Islamic world to work on the Islamic world, and hundreds of thousands of copies of the protocols of Zion were printed. And that was not all.
I just thought I would mention I had a long correspondence with Mike Pacepa. He went by Mike here in America after he defected. And of course, what was interesting to me was his experience with Yasser Arafat. Arafat had not only was trained in Moscow, but he spent time in Romania, in Bucharest, and they recorded him. They were ordered to, the Romanian Secret Service was ordered to record him because his bodyguards, Yasser Arafat was not only a communist, recruited by the Soviets, but he was a homosexual. And they really liked that about him. And he had homosexual bodyguards, and Mike Pacepa would say that he would play lion and lamb, this sexual game, with his bodyguards, and they would record, I assume video, but he said they were audio recordings, at least that he knew of. And of course, this was at the same time. Imagine in the Arab world, this is not something, in a world where people are Muslim, this is not something you would ever want to be shown about yourself.
He would not recover from that one, no.
No, he wouldn't. And of course, I think he got married. I think Arafat got married when he was around 60 years old, just a few years before his death. But that was only for show, that he was really, and this is one of the things, recruit somebody who's a homosexual, and who's somebody who, because ideology is not enough, because ideology is bunk. It is though that rant that you say in your head, and if a person's high enough up, they realize the politics is about three things. It's about power, and ideology is just a vehicle or a weapon, as your very intelligent reader noted to me, that gets you further in the game. Yeah. And if you could get dupes to follow it. But we had a conversation, I don't know if you want to talk about it, about the use of homosexuality in these networks, and how it actually could become important, and very important people like Yasser Arafat can turn out to be homosexuals.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this German study on Adolf Hitler and his homosexuality, and I think this German study by Lothar Machtan is really well done. His use of sources, and he kind of thinks like an intelligence guy, which doesn't happen too often. But the way he weighs evidence and he assigns probabilities, I think he does that really, really well. And I use the study from him as kind of a launching board to look even further and look even deeper into some of this. And I think Adolf Hitler may have even been, in his very early days, a snitch, because if you were in those homosexual circles back then in Austria, the Austrians considered you a security risk. especially if you knew people who were important, you were considered a security risk. Therefore, the Austrian government and also the Bavarian government later, they always wanted to know who was gay. And then the infamous incident happened where a very high-ranking military officer in Austria, Mr. Alfred Redl, was exposed as a traitor who sold all the military secrets to Russia. Before
And
World
this
War
was
One.
what it was. This was 1913, 1912.
Yeah, this was. Redl was exposed right before Hitler suddenly moved to Bavaria. He suddenly left Austria and moved here, which is an interesting timing. And
yeah. So
but
you think has any researcher suggested that Hitler was used as a snitch or an agent in that affair of that Austrian military officer?
I mean, there are things quoted in Machtan's study where pretty famous left-wing scientist who was working with sexual topics, sexual research, and he got a hold of old police files, I think from Bavaria, and he basically got photos, got police files, put it into a package and sent it to Moscow. And there's also things quoted from German officers who hated Hitler, but they had material on him which protected them. And there's also quite a bit of evidence pointing towards some people stashing evidence of that nature outside of Germany with a dead man switch. So in case anything should happen to them, this material would then get released or handed to, let's say, the British government or who knows who else. Mm-hmm. And so basically, if you were gay in Austria, if you were gay in Germany, for that matter, you were considered a security risk, and there was a lot of espionage with gay circles. And this guy I mentioned, this Austrian high-ranking traitor Alfred Redl, he was gay, but it turned out that him being gay wasn't the real reason why he became a traitor. But nonetheless, this launched a debate at the time, public debate in Austria. Are gays trustworthy or not? So this was viewed from a security standpoint, not just a moral standpoint according to the morals at the time. And so, and it's not just, I mean, even with, people in the Muslim world, it's not just a means to have something on somebody and to use that material. It's also an intelligence agency. They can provide sort of a safe space for gay people in high places, and they can shield those activities. So it's also a reward system.
And it's also, by the way, if you're living in a society that does not accept homosexuality and you're a homosexual, you're living a double life already.
Yeah.
Which means you already have developed all the qualities you need to be a spy.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
you
that's
see
kind of
people on a daily basis. You have a presentational persona, and you have your real hidden self, so that these people are already ready-made and qualified to be agents.
Secret code words, phrases, handshakes. So it's certain meeting places. They went to certain meeting places and they were asking certain things. That's phrases that seemed really inconspicuous. Phrases that seem normal, but somebody who was in the know would recognize that phrase. I mean, it's almost like a joke, really. Like secret handshakes, but that's what it was. That's what it was. And
of course, this is a secret community that, of course, if you have a homosexual community and they're not allowed to be, open about it because they get punished for it, that community has contacts going throughout a country, leading all kinds of places. So you would be in a position to know that important people are part of that community.
Exactly. And so in Adolf Hitler's days, being gay meant being a criminal according to the authorities. So it's very well documented that Hitler was going out all the time. So he spent his nights somewhere every night and would come back in the morning and sleep till the afternoon and then groom himself. He was really known, especially in his very early days, by, I mean, people who rented him his apartment, especially in Munich, they noticed how he was totally grooming himself, which was very uncommon at the time. And then he would go out in the early evening and come back in the morning. And he did that for a very long time. If you were gay and if you were living that kind of a life, you were getting caught at some point. And the choice would have been snitch for us or go to jail. And Hitler probably would have chosen to become a snitch. And
how long would they put if the police arrested a homosexual back then in 1912, 1913, how long would you go to jail for?
Regular cases, I think it was a year, and prisons were very bad. And there's also there were some police files mentioned in Lothar Machtan's book, which concerned Hitler's alleged encounters with men who were like 16 or 17 years old. So if you were caught with minors, that would have been worse.
Underage. So you're okay. Wait a minute. There's police files showing that he was caught with minors when he was older.
Yes. And the more Nazi high officials collected materials against one another, because there were quite a few gays in the higher Nazi ranks. And this was used as a way to further your own position if you could put pressure on somebody and if you had something on somebody. And of course, there's other factors. If you had contact with somebody who if you provided additional services to somebody, if you were used as a courier. I mean, Hitler worked as a courier in World War I, so maybe he did some side work for people that he knew back then, and this could get you in prison, that it could get you into quite a lot of trouble. And
so Hitler was, I mean, being a courier in World War I, that was kind of a protected job. It kept him out of the trenches. It kept him away from the fighting.
Yeah, some couriers were quite close to the trenches or in the trenches, and it was dangerous.
Could it be there were some homosexual commanders or generals, and that he joined the List regiment because maybe the colonel in charge of the regiment was part of the homosexual community in Munich? Or
if I remember the latest study on Hitler's war service, I think he saw like one real battle, one big battle, and quite shortly afterwards he was just removed from the front and used behind the front as a courier. And after the war, he was formally educated as a spy, as an informant, and he was supposed to infiltrate these new political parties. And he infiltrated the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, which then became the National Socialist Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, German Workers' Party. Mm-hmm. And so it's for a while, and this is confirmed, he had a double income. He was working for the party, and he was also working as an informant for the Bavarian government. And there's so much to it, and at some point we might do a whole episode on that.
So we know Yasser Arafat. We've got Hitler. There's other examples. We've got the Cambridge moles.
Yeah.
There was homosexuality. The Apostles, Burgess, Blunt, McLean, Philby. There was homosexuality in that group, or at least bisexuality.
because they apparently, the guys like Burgess, McLean, and Cairncross, and all these guys, apparently they never felt as if they really fit in. So they could go to these universities and they had all these options for their future lives, but somehow they felt like the outcasts. They felt like they had their own world, and the Soviets, they took advantage of that, I guess, mm-hmm. and that became quite a big thing. And So yeah, I got some notes here. That's also from Mr. Pachepa, the Soviet defector. I mean, he gives quite a bit more detail. So the fake protocols of Zion ended up in the school curriculum in Muslim nations. It's on television, and there's other stuff like the International Jew, this essay collection, which was also really popular with the Nazis, and so yeah, this became sort of the modern core of how the Muslims viewed the world and viewed history. I mean, usually it's always the Quran and the other supplemental texts. This is how you judge things. But then came the protocols of Zion and conventional conspiracy mythology, and it seems like Hamas is consciously or subconsciously basing some of their most important decisions on the fake protocols of Zion and this idea that tiny Jewish families took over the British Empire unmolested, and so this could become a big problem. And
of course, do we find this in in Iran, among the clerics? I do recall there was a number of people like David Duke types in the United States have been invited to Tehran.
Sure.
And they had some kind of historical revisionist conference in Iran some years ago, where I think it was Ahmadinejad had this all these Holocaust denying, historical revisionists there. And this made the news here in the West. So this goes along with this kind of
so there are people out there. There are people out there. There's right-wingers out there. Right-wingers aligning with Muslims, radical Muslims, because they think they have a common enemy, Jewish people. And then the Soviets told the radical Muslims, we have a common enemy, and it's the Jews. And where does this end? Where does this end? In 1965, the Egyptian government published a pamphlet called "Israel, the Enemy of Africa." So yeah, this basically brought this to Africa, and of course, if the Russians in recent years, if they got involved in, or even the decades before, the Russians got involved.
The protocols was created by the Russian Secret Service back more than 120 years ago.
Exactly. So I mean, if you imagine Europe, in the south, you have Northern Africa, and they. Quite a bit of people in Northern Africa, they think that Europe is also run by Jews. And, it's just this blend of Christians and Jews that must be destroyed so Muslims can take over Europe. So it's just everybody is believing this stuff.
A couple thoughts about why this stuff is used and why it seems to be so effective and why it gets people going. Two thoughts. One thoughts are that if you yourself are devious, you're a conspirator, you use secret methods, you manipulate people, a story about somebody else doing it diverts away from the fact that that's exactly what you're doing. And then in fact, the story about a secret conspiratorial group actually hides the fact that you're the conspiratorial manipulator. It's quite amazing. It's like, not me, it's him that's manipulating you. Here, do what I say because I'm going to help you get rid of him, right?
Yeah, and there's material. This is really interesting. There's material that has been confirmed by others. Material provided by the defector, Mr. Pachepa, Operation SIG, to radicalize Muslims, and there was also the link to the communists in the West. So for example, we had a terrorist problem in a few decades ago in Western Germany. Communist terrorists were trying to destabilize Western Germany. This was right around the time the Americans had, I think, the Weathermen. This was sort of the era.
The Baader-Meinhof gang, right?
Exactly. And so this was a group of rather young-ish communists in Western Germany, and they visited Muslim training camps, which were basically run by the Soviets anyway, or just aided by the Soviets. So you have communists working with radical Muslims to get trained in terrorism to attack Europe. And so by that logic at the time, the communists thought they had the same enemy as the Muslims. Well, which makes really no sense. And of course, some Muslim countries, as you said, some Muslim countries, they have tried their own version of socialism. But fundamentally, socialism is anti-religion. And it's anti-tradition, and it's anti-patriarchy, and it's anti-so many things. So, but still, communists, quite a few communist terrorists actually were trained by these radical Muslims. And it was sort of a revolving door, because Soviet Eastern Germany, they had a unit, I think it was called the AKS. They called it these, like for special operations or something. And this was sort of a communist version of the British SOE. So they try to copy the SOE training down to a T. And so the Stasi...
SOE was Special Operational Executive?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
So the training was fairly similar, and the communists trained communists in these methods to take over Western Germany, but they also trained Muslims, and then you had those trained Muslims who trained some other communists. So it was this revolving door.
Let me run by a Czech source that told me about this and see what you say. I had a Czech source 23 years ago, just before 9/11. Who told me that Muhammad Atta, or he told me this after 9/11. He said that he knew that Muhammad Atta, the lead terrorist in the 9/11 bombing, was trained in 1987 in a communist terrorist training camp in communist Czechoslovakia. Mm. And that, of course, when he was a student in, I think, Hamburg, he was an engineering student in a German university, but that he would slip over the Iron Curtain into Czechoslovakia, and he would get this training, presumably in the summer when he wasn't in school. What do you think of that story?
Oh, I've seen some things that are quite similar. So the Soviets controlled certain Muslim territories, so they try to get into the radical Muslim game, and there's quite a bit of overlap between the Russians and these Muslim extremist networks who were tied to 9/11.
And the Russian communists really got very deep into Yemen, which is very interesting, because Osama bin Laden's family is originally from Yemen, and the trouble in Yemen now traces back to the fact that there was a communist country in Yemen during the Cold War.
Now, obviously, American intelligence and British intelligence, obviously, they try to infiltrate the Muslim world for obvious reasons, and it's sort of a very, very tough balance to strike, because if you don't infiltrate, you're blind. But if you do infiltrate, this can become a problem as well. And my sneaking suspicion is that especially Britain is compromised. Britain is probably very, very compromised by the Russians, and this has been going on for a very long time. As I said, Britain was responsible for some of the worst intelligence failures, and it was always the Americans who had to deal with the consequences. Kim Philby
and Klaus,
the Cambridge guys, atomic spies. I mean, the British promised the Americans that these scientists were safe. They were vetted. People like Klaus Fuchs, who was
was, by the
originally
way, known to be a communist in Great Britain.
yeah, and he had, I mean, this guy had this whole family was communist. They were all communists, and
Yeah.
in recent studies, like in the book Trinity, about this Klaus Fuchs case, experts have looked at this over and over, and they figured that British intelligence they had to catch this guy early, but they didn't. And it was so bad that people even assumed there must have been a highly placed mole to protect Klaus Fuchs, send him to America, to the Manhattan Project, and so he could steal all these atomic secrets.
Yeah,
And
I have the book. The book here is Treachery by Chapman Pincher, and he actually goes through. This is part of. This is part of the whole Spycatcher scandal. That the head of MI5, Sir Roger Hollis, was at the time of Klaus Fuchs, he was the guy in MI5 who was responsible for watching all the communists domestically in Great Britain, and ultimately became in the 60s the head of MI5. And it was the deputy head of MI5, Mr. Wright, who wrote the book Spycatcher, who said, look, I was the deputy head of MI5. I believe the head of MI5, my boss, Sir Roger Hollis, was a Soviet agent. And there's been William West wrote a book on this documenting Sir Roger Hollis's background, showing his communist connections. Chapman Pincher did incredible work on that. And it's like you go back and you go, oh my gosh, Sir Roger Hollis covered up for Klaus Fuchs. It's a fact.
Yeah, it's horrendous. And so if we apply this problem to this current situation, so basically Britain has some control over Qatar, and Qatar is really, really successful with energy. So they're moving quite the amount of liquid gas and other stuff. They make quite a bit of money, and some of that Qatar money ends up with Hamas. So for some point, Iran was paying Hamas quite a bit, then others chipped in, and now apparently for the last couple of years, Qatar has been financing Hamas. And
isn't Hamas aligned with Moscow even now?
Yeah, the Russians do not consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization, and Russia's allies also do not consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization.
And China doesn't either.
No. And
that is so interesting. So here we have this problem, and it's an intelligence problem, and it's a problem of distinguishing friends from enemies. And we've got all these people in the West who are actually double agents, who are blurring the line between friend and enemy.
Yeah, I mean, if we let's imagine high-placed moles in Britain, right? Traitors who give these secrets to the Russians. If we imagine these moles to be in place, Britain has some control. Britain has some control over Qatar, and Qatar has some control over Hamas, and it's probably the case, again, that the British tell the Americans, do not worry, we're handling this. Because Britain has this old history in the region, Egypt and all these places. So the British are saying...
And Lawrence of Arabia, right?
Yeah, the T. Lawrence.
Some people say was a homosexual, right?
So
we get back to that again.
So the British say, we got all these old networks in the region, dating back 100 years or even more. So let us handle this, and we figure things out with the Saudis and, the Qataris and all that. So we, the British, we infiltrate radical Islam, and it's all going to work out fine in the end. But what if there are these high-placed moles in Britain and they give away all these secrets to the Russians? This could be a disaster, not just for Israel, but also for many others. And so Israel depends on Europe, Britain, and the United States for help. But how compromised are those helpers?
Yeah, with the Mossad, now we've got a lot of Israelis come out of the former Soviet Union, some come out of the West, some kind of come out of Central Europe. Talk about Mossad for a second.
Well, I mean, it's the Mossad itself is fairly tiny, but of course, intelligence for the longest time, intelligence was not done by big formal organizations. So there's new studies on the Roman Empire. Intelligence was far bigger than we previously thought, and my opinion is that in the later history, especially Europe, intelligence networks were far greater than previously believed, and was oftentimes family-based, aristocratic families, and it was not like you would expect it to be today, like this big headquarters and formal name and a formal budget. So they did it the old school way, and I think the Israelis are very much the same. So they what you see as the Mossad is like this tiny thing because Israel is such a tiny country, but of course they have these other networks around the world, and they try their best to protect Israel and provide security. But as you mentioned, when Jews came from the Soviet Union to Israel, I mean, we know Stalin wanted to infiltrate Israel, and I think even Stalin, he even formally accepted Israel to be a country.
Yes, so, he was one of the first to step up and do that, and of course the Zionists were socialists. They believed in a kind of socialism.
Yeah, and there's these connections, of course, right from the beginning of Israel and these formal organizations such as the Mossad. So, for example, usually people talk about the connection to the connection, I think, to the British Rothschild arm. Mm-hmm. And usually this is interpreted as, the Jewish world conspiracy thing, which isn't real. But especially the Rothschild family initially was recruited by German aristocracy. It was the Landgraf of Hessen-Kassel, right? Mm-hmm. So this was part of Germany back in the old days, was not a unified empire such as other empires. And especially Hessen became really, really important. The aristocratic families of Hessen at some point controlled the British throne and the Russian throne. So the Tsars in Russia, they were Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein, and the British throne, especially in the later generations, the British throne was a mix of Hessen. Some people call them, or the Mountbatten family was Hessen, basically.
And what about Catherine the Great?
Yeah, she was. She's Putin's favorite, and
she was not Russian at all. She was German.
Yeah, she had this operation running to kill I think her predecessor. And she had this thing with the Orloff family who spied against Germany. I think Otto von Bismarck.
She basically took over Russia in a coup, essentially.
Yeah, and from that moment on, the Tsars kept bringing in these essentially German princesses, to a point where the Russian throne was the same. The Russian throne was the same as the British one. So it's Hessen, Schleswig-Holstein, and with the British it was Sachsen, Coburg, and Gotha. So these names describe the aristocratic families and also the places they initially controlled.
And of course, if you study the life of Queen Victoria, you find out that the people that mentored her, that set up her arranged marriage with her husband, that they had this vision for peace in Europe by linking all the largest royal families in Europe to a common bloodline, so they would all be one family and there would be peace, supposedly, in Europe.
So you had these aristocratic families, and they on a regular basis they would recruit new people for specific tasks. So, for example, I mean this was a European tradition. So aristocratic families they tended to recruit some Jewish people to conduct foreign trade because they spoke the languages and for various,
espionage.
yeah, and for espionage, and also because if the ruling aristocrat had some unpopular changes to implement, he could use some Jewish people to force these changes to happen. So people would get angry at those Jewish folks. So that was also something very common in Europe. And one other reason why they used Jewish people was you could control them even more than any regular person.
Because they were vulnerable.
All over Europe, Jews had almost no legal protection whatsoever, and they were usually centered in these tiny places where all the Jewish people had to live. And back in those days, you could not just threaten a specific asset you had recruited, you could also threaten his family, his neighbors, and the entire Jewish community. So the ultimate threat was to just burn down the whole Jewish community if somebody proved to be illoyal towards the aristocracy. So at some point, the Landgraf of Hessen-Kassel recruited the first Rothschild to perform certain tasks, protect his money from Napoleon, for example, and regain some assets from the French. And Rothschild did what he was expected to do, and that's why Rothschild was then referred to the British government, to the British throne, and as I suspect, British intelligence. And so then British intelligence uses the Rothschild family to supply money to the Duke of Wellington. So this was just a task. You recruit people, they do a task, and at some point, the British developed the new banking system, and they needed somebody as the public face of these private merchant banks, Lloyd's and Barclays and so on. And some people used as the public faces. Some people picked to be the public faces of the banks. Some people were the Rothschilds. But others were like the Baring family. The Barings Bank was quite a big bank for a while. And the Barings, they were actually called Baring. They are from Hanover, which is the origin of King George I and his successors. So this was an important territory, Hanover, and so they recruited people like the Barings for certain tasks and then gave them bigger tasks. So if you have people like the Rothschilds involved in the foundation of Israel, and you have British people involved in Israel, that opens up all kinds of espionage problems, because if the British are compromised, then it's a very bad situation. So it's possible that the Russians were able to infiltrate Israel from two sides: the migrants and also these Western networks, Western networks that were compromised.
That's one of the problems that, for example, the head of German military intelligence during World War II ran into, is that he was against Hitler. He wanted the war to be ended early. He wanted to save lives. He wanted to save Jews. But then when he worked with the British, when he tried to give something to the British, you had Kim Philby, who was in a position to know that the British were communicating with and we still don't know the full story about Canaris, was communicating with them, and Kim Philby would go and tell Soviet intelligence, who he was really working for. And so the Soviets then would, for example, leak information to Reinhard Heydrich, who was the head of the SA, who then realized that Canaris was committing treason. And so then the British had to go in and send a team to assassinate Heydrich, to keep Heydrich from revealing Canaris. And so then, which of course caused a whole bunch of innocent Czech people to die, because they made it to be that the Czech underground had killed him, and I think they did use some Czechs, but in essence, that whole assassination, one of the theories is the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich was about covering up for the fact that Canaris was working with the British, which got found out by the Soviets, who tried to leak it. So you look at how complicated this interaction is.
Yeah, and before World War I, the British intelligence tried to help the Tsarist Russian intelligence, and they sent a bunch of people, and you had all the big names involved, Mansfield Cummings, and there's all the big names involved, and
Sidney Riley.
Yeah, and they built these networks in Russia, and they were hoping that this would actually pay off, and this would work out in everybody's interests. And I have a sneaking suspicion that the British throne was considering getting into the socialist game, toying with the idea of maybe have a monarchy and socialism below that. So the monarchy is in charge, but anything below the monarchy and the aristocracy, anything else, the normal people, they would live in some sort of a socialist system.
Well, isn't that really what King Charles III believes?
Well,
is that his game?
The British didn't create the London School of Economics for nothing, and they didn't create the Fabians for nothing. And I have the sneaking suspicion that some idea was toyed with for the Russian Empire, because the Tsars, they knew they couldn't continue the way the empire was going. But you had this regular aristocracy, this older aristocracy in Russia that did not want change. And there is some stuff in the early communist literature where this idea was floated: keep the Tsars, but have socialism below that. Now, it's not exactly clear, and I've been working on this for a while, it's not exactly clear how exactly the British got themselves involved in that. Maybe they messed up again, which they have done many times.
Which British? And of course, your classic Tory British aristocrat isn't going to go for this.
No, it was the German-based high-level aristocracy. So families like Hessen, families like Schleswig-Holstein, Denmark. So these people kept to themselves. They always kept to themselves. And people in Britain, after King George I, after he ascended to the throne, people in the following generations, they expected those new kings and their relatives to marry into the broader British aristocracy. But these weird families that literally came from Germany, these weird families kept to themselves. And
so why didn't they ever, if they had gotten into the Romanovs, why didn't they try then to reestablish the Romanovs? Why were they, what was the game there? And of course, they put one of their members on the throne of Greece.
Yeah, I mean, the big problem of the Romanovs, I mean, the full name of the Romanov clan is Schleswig-Holstein Romanov-Gottorf. So they are from the house of Schleswig-Holstein and Hessen. But so the Tsars had this big problem. They did not have full control over Russia. They had to share the power with the regular traditional Russian aristocracy, and those were actual Russians. Those were not Germans. And so they had to share the power, and it became a problem because Russia was so backwards, but the Russian aristocracy, they did not want change.
Well, one of the factors in the Russian Revolution wasn't it, and of course we're talking about what they call the February Revolution, wasn't it that they thought, look, the Tsarina is really sympathetic to the German cause, to our enemy, and that we can't trust her?
Well, I mean, I've been doing this report on Tsar Catherine Tsar Catherine the Great and how she managed to infiltrate the German circles, influence Otto von Bismarck, and just steer things in a way so that Mr. Bismarck would make the wrong choices. You know, just have Germany entangled with the French and the Austrians so that there wouldn't be this alliance between France and Germany, which would, because Russia did not want that alliance.
You don't mean
British.
Catherine the Great. You mean somebody else you were referring to. Catherine the Great was in the 18th century.
She was the but at the time Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck was the Reichschancellor. The Russians actually infiltrated his close circle, and so he made all the wrong choices. And it's just a
so the Russians. Well, of course, Otto von Bismarck was always very pro-Russian. He wanted Prussia to be aligned with Russia. So
Exactly.
tell me a little more. So you think that Bismarck was compromised by Russian intelligence?
I think his the people around him were highly suspicious, and how they influenced his choices, and he made specific choices that proved to be disastrous for Germany in the following decades. That was a problem. Let me just pull this up real quick.
Yeah, because the classical history of Bismarck is that Bismarck was right and Kaiser Wilhelm II was wrong about Russia, and that the Kaiser Wilhelm II junked his alliance with Russia to ally with Austro-Hungary, and that it was ultimately disastrous. That was the ultimate disaster for Germany, because it got Germany, it created the Central Powers, and it got Germany trapped in a two-fronted war, World War I, which was ultimately a loser for Germany.
Well, the dominating force in Germany at the time was Prussia, which is kind of the east of Germany, and the main family line in Prussia was called Hohenzollern, and they did have family relations to Britain and Russia.
Yes,
but ultimately, the Hohenzollern, they lost power. They lost that game, and because of these limited family relations, there was always that hope for Germany to make an arrangement with the British and make an arrangement with the Russians, but that proved to be very, very deceptive. And so I got this here. It was here it was 1859. Bismarck was sent to St. Petersburg in Russia.
That's right, and he loved it there. He actually really enjoyed being a diplomat in St. Petersburg.
And
yes,
he did. And he had a love affair, which was probably set up for him. He had a love affair with an aristocratic woman, Catherine Orlova, who was the wife of the Russian diplomat for Belgium, a certain Nikolai Alexeyevich Orlov. And so that's what, exactly. So the Orlov clan was involved in espionage, and 5 brothers from the Orlov clan, they were awarded in 1762 by Tsar Catherine the Great from the House of Holstein-Gottorp. They were awarded with an aristocratic title because they helped her remove her husband from power, basically.
Which was Paul.
Yeah, right? Paul. I don't know which number.
Tsar Paul, right?
Yeah, I don't know which number, but it was one of them.
Yeah, I forget what. Maybe he was the first or the second. I forget.
I don't remember the number, but so the Orlovs helped her get rid of this guy, and the Orlov guys then were rewarded, and later, decades, quite a few decades later, this Orlov family, this Orlov guy basically allowed his wife to have an affair with Otto von Bismarck, which
And
is,
Bismarck was a guy who would have affairs.
yeah,
He
yeah,
was a guy that was he very much was susceptible to that.
exactly. And
Um,
so he
yeah,
got, I mean, Germany thought it was a good idea to have a war with the French, which was not a good choice. There was also unnecessary tensions with the Austrians. You know, a lot of bad decisions were made. And
and so you think the Franco-Prussian War? You talk about the Franco-Prussian War. Is that
yeah,
what you're
that
talking
was
about?
that was a
Well, which of
bad choice.
course Napoleon III started that war.
Sure, he made
Technically,
bad choice. He made bad
he made a
choices
bad
too
choice,
because
but didn't.
The French knew you could not trust the Germans because the Germans in the past had allied themselves with enemies of France.
Right, and of course, so but you had this Franco-Prussian War was used to create the German Empire. It made
It,
Germany, right?
yeah, and it looked like a big victory. Now, of course, they were prancing around in Versailles in the French palace, and
Hmm.
everybody thought this
They had a
was
victory march through Paris there, which they
exactly.
probably shouldn't have had.
Everybody thought this was a great victory, and there was just a big problem attached to this
Well, the big
victory.
problem that was attached was when Germany annexed Alsace-Lorraine, I should call it, Alsace-Lorraine, which the French were so angry about that they contemplated revenge ever after and were eager to get into the World War to take that territory back, which they ultimately
Yeah.
did.
And even the German territory, because officially Germany became an empire, because before it was just lots of small
Right.
empires, and now it was supposedly one empire. It was just a big problem. It really wasn't a unified empire because all these different bits and pieces were governed by different families, and some of these families were basically the same families as the British throne and the Russian throne. So, for example, um, the territories that were incorporated into the new German Empire, territories such as Schleswig-Holstein,
Hmm.
Hanover, Hessen,
Hmm.
Nassau. And so all of these territories were full of spies who basically were members of these certain aristocratic families or worked for these families. And then when Bismarck was regarded as this great, successful man, he was so he in the background he was managing his wealth, and he picked a certain person to manage his money, a man by the name of Gerson Bleichröder. Um, and that was not a good idea because Gerson Bleichröder's father, he was a close partner of the Rothschild banking clan, which of course has its own history with specific aristocratic families and the British Empire.
But of course, what's interesting, you go back to the 7 Years' War, and the British Empire and all these German families and Prussia were all part of this alliance that fought what was really the first real world war, which was the 7 Years' War, that made the British Empire what it was and established sort of the primacy of Britain as the most powerful country in the world in all kinds of respects. And of course, that, the American Revolution was a bit of revenge that the French had by helping the Americans. But other than that, when the French Revolution happened and Napoleon comes along, the British are at hand to again work with Prussia, work with the German states, work with Austria, work with Russia. And it was sort of like Napoleon against all of them.
Yeah, and so the Germans wanted to prevent another Napoleonic era, so it was the German Empire's explicit desire to keep France as weak as possible, which pretty soon led to an alliance between France and Russia.
Of course,
And
and they had been, well, of course, the alliance of France and Russia happened because France was so angry at Germany
yeah, yeah.
that they then offered to build the Russian railroad system.
for the
Because the
military.
French knew that if Russia had modern railroads, Russia had the biggest population in any of the
Yeah.
countries that were in Europe, and they could have the biggest army. And if that army could get on trains, they could woo woo
Mhm.
rail right up to the German border and invade Germany from
Yeah.
the
So
from the east.
when I recently reread the 2012 book by Christopher Clark, I think he's a Cambridge historian,
Hmm.
and so he basically tells you that the driving force behind World War One was Russia, not Germany, because Germany was in a weak alliance. They had no desire to have a big war, and
Now that's
Russia.
interesting. Let me, I had after our presentation last time, you had mentioned this, and I had a caller who asked me about, or not a caller, a reader who wrote a kind of a long thing about this, asking this question. But wait a minute, the history of World War One, and I had made the comment, well, Russia did mobilize first, right, before
Yeah.
Germany, and then they brought up these papers that Kautsky had done the investigation. You're familiar with Kautsky's papers, which showed that Kautsky's papers, people misread it and thought, well, maybe Germany actually made the decision to mobilize first. But Kautsky cleared that up and said, no, that isn't the problem. But the problem is that people say that Germany made all these mistakes. That Germany had this, this Schlieffen plan, and that Germany had this. Germany wasn't innocent in all this. Could you explain what this is? How is it that Russia wanted World War One and engineered it?
Well, first of all, for hundreds of years in Europe, and any self-respecting historian will have to admit that, for hundreds of years, the
Mm,
game was played like this. You try to form a stronger alliance, and then you destroy the weaker alliance. This
right.
this this was basically the game. It's like the television show Survivor, right? When you have these different groups and they have to make secret alliances, and then at a certain point, you try to blindside
Well,
the.
they did it to destroy Napoleon.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
try to blindside the opposition, and so that's how the game was played. So every country was either waging war or preparing the next war. So this is where the infamous this infamous thing comes from. If you want peace, prepare for war. It sounds paradoxical, but it describes sort of this crazy
It's an old
reality.
Roman proverb, actually.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
describes the reality, and which we saw here. And so this was the game. So obviously every country was always preparing for war, and they had war plans ready in case they were needed. So you can't really pinpoint, oh, this country wanted war. They all were living in this reality where warfare was happening again and again. And so when Germany was in a weak alliance with Austria, they were not in the position to think in terms of let's have a big war and we're going to be successful. That was not the
Because
time.
they knew they were already surrounded by France and
Exactly.
Russia.
So the stronger alliance was France, Britain, and Russia. And especially Russia had scaled up its military to 1.5 million soldiers. So
Yeah,
you
they
didn't
had.
need.
And there was also the Germans also were tricked because they thought Italy was their
Yeah.
ally. And Italy
So
had these secret deals that were
yeah.
working for the other alliance,
So
right?
I'm perfectly aware that everybody always wants to play the victim, and this is unfortunately a reality. But if we look at World War One, it was simply a matter of am I in the weak alliance or am I in a strong alliance? And so Germany was in a weak alliance, and
And
this
Germany
is.
probably obviously didn't know that Italy was not going to support Germany and Austria. And they probably thought Italy was going to. And they
Yeah.
also had Turkey. By the way, Turkey was part of the Central Powers and did go to war. But so wait, let's just go to the sequence of events. So, because this blame game, somebody mentioned Harry Elmer Barnes, and it's been years since he's an American historian who wrote against the German war guilt thesis in World War One. And I just ordered his book because I read him so long ago, I don't remember much of it. But let's go through the sequence now. Archduke Francis Ferdinand is assassinated by the Black Hand terrorists in Sarajevo.
Yeah.
In what was it, June of 1914?
Something like that.
June something. Yeah. And then, of course, this is terrible because he's the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. This is a terrible blow to the royal family. It's a terrible blow to the monarchy. And it's a terrorist act. And of course, there's this argument about the Black Hand and Serbian intelligence being behind it. And you hear stories about who's really at fault. And of course, the Serbians are Southern Slavs. They're part of they look to Moscow for protection.
Yeah.
So Austria gives an ultimatum, and Austria starts, and of course the Germans are aligned with Austria. They're supporting so the Russians say, no, you don't. If you mobilize against Serbia, we will mobilize against you. Yeah. And the Kaiser says, wait a minute, if you mobilize, I'm going to have to mobilize. So explain to me, why weren't the Russians just protecting their Serbian allies? Why does it become the Russians intentionally triggered the war for their own reasons? I mean, after all, Russia had just lost the Russo-Japanese war. Did they really have confidence they were going to win? Is that why they pushed so hard? Was it intentional?
Well, Russia could not really afford that kind of a war, but they leveraged anything they had, territory, mines, anything they could. They would leverage anything to loan money from France and other places and buy arms and build these railroads. So they were going all in, so to say.
And Russia had a scary sized army.
Yeah, and so it's. I mean, if you look at this from the other side, a potential enemy of Russia, was this an attractive option of starting a war against Russia? Not really, because it's the same problem that Napoleon had. The front line is too long and the distances are too long, the weather is too bad. No, I mean, of course, some German military guys had floated ideas, maybe we could attack Russia one day. But these ideas were always floated.
The elder Moltke, I know this from my military history, the elder Moltke, who won the Franco-Prussian War, who was the soldier that stood next to Bismarck, when he saw this idea of a Franco-Russian alliance, he had the most common sense of all the soldiers. Schlieffen did not have a lick of common sense. But von Moltke had common sense. And von Moltke said, look, if you have France and Germany, France and Russia surrounding Germany, and you go to war, it's very simple. You march into Russia, you smash their armies, you force them to peace, because the Russians are just really bad at war. They just don't have the sophistication we do. And you use the Rhine as a shield. You build a west wall, and it's a short enough front, you can hold the French off forever while you beat, and then you turn around and you confront France and you say, look, we just defeated your ally. We're twice as big as you. You're going to come to terms with us. Now that seemed to me, bravo.
But Moltke, what about bravo. Britain? If Britain is another problem, then you're basically.
But Britain is only a problem if the Kaiser falls in love with the Navy, you build a big fleet, and then you invade Belgium, which Britain has these ancient treaties to protect Belgium, right?
These plans, of course, all these countries, they always had developed plans to attack another country.
So
what
is the theory? Did the czars want a world war and decide, or did someone in Russia want the world war and decide we're going to do the mobilization no matter what because we're going to come out on top?
War is always a calculation. So that you make the decision based on the numbers you run and the probabilities you run, because you can always choose to wait to not have war and wait for a better opportunity. And this alliance of France, Britain, and Russia, they seem fairly confident, and they seem fairly confident that this was the right time. I mean, you shouldn't forget that at the time, industrialization was picking up speed in Germany. And so you had all these new inventions, you had the scaling up of German industry, and apparently in the minds of Russia, which was really backwards, in the mind of Russia, it was a bad choice to wait. Because if you wait 10 more years, 20 more years, the Germans may gain the advantage through technology. So there's all kinds of factors that go into this decision of going to war. They always project into the future. What's this going to be like in 10 years or in 20 years or in 30 years? And I think at a certain point, the Germans had actually more industrial production than Britain, or was
Germany was overtaking Britain in many markets.
Britain, and the leader was still the United States, but Germany was advancing rapidly, and maybe that was a factor to decide for war instead of waiting, because the Germans, they did these calculations as well. To the Germans, it was clear that war was coming one way or the other, because the Russians had scaled up their troops to 1.5 million men. So it was just a question of when it would happen, and the Germans debated.
And the Russians really, as the country that, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is Russia mobilized for war first, in terms of general mobilization. Austria was mobilizing against Serbia, though, right?
The distinctions were not clear anymore. In the earlier decades, or maybe 100 years earlier, there was a very clear distinction between a partial mobilization, a general mobilization, and peacetime. But with the new technology and the mass logistics that were possible, it was not a clear distinction anymore. So if Russia scales up its troops like this and builds all this artillery and buys all this ammunition, you don't need a formal document. You don't need a formal mobilization or a declaration of war.
Actual mobilization is when the order goes out that everybody's being mobilized. And the fact is, you can't hide a general mobilization. The minute that order goes out, because you're mobilizing millions of people, everybody's going to know you're doing it, because you're mobilizing millions of people. And so, and the thing is that very famously, it was a Russian general who said, mobilization is war.
Yeah.
Right? Because the minute you mobilize, the other guy's got to mobilize. And you can't, now you got a runaway train. You cannot stop this mobilization process, because if you stop your mobilization and the other one continues, he'll have the advantage.
And so it happens in the modern war era. Things happen in stages. So, Russia was running out of artillery shells in 1915. So they still had logistical problems. So you can't just scale up to millions of active soldiers.
And Russia has these kind of logistical problems. Russia is the country that has always had these logistical problems and had these technology problems, and it's just sort of the nature of Russian military.
So let's run a different scenario, just a hypothetical different scenario. Mm-hmm. Let's assume Germany had an alliance with the British and the French, right? If that had been the case, if that had been a strong alliance, the Germans, the British, and the French, they could have decided to attack Russia and take over Russia. That is entirely conceivable. So we're not talking in these simplistic black and white moral categories. It's always a calculation, and there's many factors that go into this. Mm-hmm. But this notion that Germany was going nuts and they were envisioning these great victories, that was just not realistic.
It's people like Barbara Tuchman and actually the former president Teddy Roosevelt, who kind of depicted the Germans in this way, that they were these evil imperialists, kind of this image of Germany. And of course, Kaiser Wilhelm himself, the way he behaved publicly, he actually behaved they could depict him this way, right? Yeah. Because he's a guy who kind of had a chip on his shoulder, and he was a grandson of Queen Victoria, but the family didn't really like him. They treated him badly, and of course he had a birth defect.
And for a long time, Germany was really boring. I mean, it was not a unified empire for hundreds and hundreds of years. And you had all these major players, such as France and Britain and many others, that some that came and went. And Germany was rather boring. They always had to hedge their bets, and some parts of Germany had to align themselves with Napoleon for a while because they felt they were forced to do that. And
of course, you have this division in Germany between Catholic and Protestant. It went back to the 30 Years' War.
They were killing each other. They were killing each other on German territory, and it was not a central major player, but.
And you had Cardinal Richelieu, whose entire policy was based on dividing and conquering Germany and keeping Germany from ever being united.
Yeah. So there was no German history of let's play the big mega empire and let's just overshine everybody else. I mean, this came later with the Nazis because they were properly bonkers. And with the Nazis, it's fairly obvious when they declared war, when they went into Poland. Of course, they had their excuses, but I mean, Second World War is a different case. Second World War was far different, and
right.
It's interesting that a Cambridge historian such as Christopher Clark that he puts this book out in 2012 when Germany is no longer relevant in a military sense, but the big threat is now Russia. So 2 years before taking Crimea, this book comes out, and it says the driving force behind World War I was really Russia, not the Germans. So
because the Russians wanted Constantinople, they wanted to extend their empire into the Balkans.
They already had extended. I mean, this is what
they had. Bulgaria
was.
It wasn't it true that Bulgaria was really essentially created as a country by the Tsar.
Yeah, and in the 50 years prior, the Russians did extend. They had expanded quite a bit, and it was. I mean, everybody knows Russia always expands when it can, and it contracts when it has to.
Yeah, in fact, you don't get, people. I've hit this from Americans. They get this from the left-wing propaganda from the Cold War. It's like, well, Russia's always been peaceful. They're always being invaded, and they can think of the big invasions of Russia, but they forget. Russia's invaded more than it's been invaded, because you do not get to be the world's largest country covering, the Russian Empire was more than 12 time zones. Now they're 11 time zones. But you don't get to be the world's biggest country if you don't invade a lot of people.
Yeah.
And the fact is why do you get invaded? Because you're such a nuisance. You keep invading. People are afraid of you. They start to invade you back.
And it's also, I mean, in the times of Napoleon, you didn't have motorized vehicles. You didn't have the modern logistics and all that. So it was an advantage that Russia had for a long time, that they could watch the enemy move into Russian territory and then get themselves into trouble. I mean, Napoleon, he famously was sitting down in the palaces, in the big Russian palaces
in the Kremlin,
and they were cheering themselves on, but they knew they can't hold it, and even escaping would be a problem.
The mayor of Moscow released all the prisoners from the prisons in Moscow,
and they torched the city.
Gave them incendiaries to burn the city down around Napoleon.
Yeah.
So what they did is they basically burned the city down around Napoleon, so he had no shelter. He couldn't spend the winter there.
Yeah.
They had plundered all the grain. They'd burned down all the grain. So basically Napoleon had to leave the city. I think it was in late October. He was waiting for the Tsar to make peace with him, and he had to go and find somewhere where there was food and warmth for his army, and he couldn't find it.
The retreat, Napoleon's retreat was so problematic that he arrived back home with barely any functioning troops, barely any horses that were still alive.
Yeah, their horses all died because
many officers died, and he promised he could raise another 300,000 soldiers, but the officers would have to be trained. The horses didn't exist.
Right. Yeah, he
It
had no
was
horses,
it was a
so he
mess.
didn't have the cavalry to win. Exactly right.
It was a
Um,
mess.
it
So
was a mess.
obviously
But
Russia tried to use its territory to their own for their own advantage.
yeah,
And
Russia was the big victor in the Napoleonic Wars in terms of it doesn't matter how many battles they lost when it came to nations, the Battle of Nations, the Battle of Leipzig, they won, and then Napoleon was done. He could not come back from that anymore.
yeah, and it was at some point, of course, it was an alliance of multiple states against Napoleon. But yeah, I mean, this didn't really work out in the end for especially the Germans. I mean, they thought they did what they had to do, just push back against France and get rid of the
Now,
French.
there's an issue that relates to us in all this, in that the monarchies and the conservative powers, which included, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, they saw the French Revolution as a existential threat. And of course, the French Republic ended. Napoleon made himself emperor, but they saw Napoleon and the liberal empire that he created as not legitimate. They didn't accept it. Edmund Burke did not accept the French Revolution, and Burke was very influential among German conservatives. Metternich was very much influenced by Burke. So, but now we go to what's really interesting is it seems like here we are in the 21st century, and we've got this I guess you could call it the leprosy of the French Revolution has come back on us all. We've got all these countries, they believe in different kinds of egalitarianism, and we've got the Soviet successor regime under Vladimir Putin, which is definitely not a legitimate country. We've got the communist left infiltrated all throughout Europe and is really behind Russia and China and the Russia and China alliance. I mean, it almost sounds like we've been that almost everything. This is the problem I have with a lot of my conservative friends is that what do I say to them? They go, well, America's bad. The European Union is bad. And it's like, well, yeah, there's a crisis of legitimacy of right and wrong, of bad ideology everywhere. But yet there is something fundamentally wicked about communist China, about the Russian Federation, about, Iran. I mean, how do you view all this?
Well, I mean, to me, when we talk about, let's say, the United States, or we talk about Europe, or the European Union, or even a smaller specific country in Europe, it's actually a very complex thing, a very complex organism. And I mean, this goes back to what the confusion that was described by Christopher Clark when he wrote about the First World War, because people are used to say, well, France did this and Germany did that, but when you actually get down into who made the decisions, it's actually quite a bit of work to figure out who made the decisions and who was in charge of what exactly and who influenced whom. So this is something that people need to remember. For example, when an empire feels the necessity to do something harsh, it's always based on an actual calculation. And when you do certain operations, it's based on fulfilling that calculation. And so when somebody does a certain task and he reports to his superior, he trusts that superior. But what happens when you have moles, high-placed moles? What happens if there are malicious networks? Because it's easy when you're young and when you're a bit naive and it's all very black and white to you, right? The world seems very different if you're actually in it, if you're right in the action. So if an empire or if a state or whatever, if they do something that's kind of nefarious or harsh, it's not always the same. It might be a reasonable calculation behind this, but then it might be nefarious, very nefarious
or what
modes
about
or
just,
circles,
what about
nefarious
just stupidity?
networks being behind this.
Well, what about just the stupidity of massive miscalculation that we don't have Napoleons or Metternichs or Bismarcks or the kind of geniuses that sort of manage this, that were able to manage it well.
I think
what if they're just not as smart as they used to be? Yeah.
I think a lot of this goes back to obfuscation techniques. For example, when the Russians or the Soviets, when they did this Operation Trust, they made sure it was so convoluted that not even a traitor, not even a defector could understand all of it. So it's just you try to overwhelm people with the complexity, artificial complexity of an operation, and so everybody just falls in line. They do what they're told because they have no way of understanding the core of this thing.
And so do you think that the Russians are still on top and that they're the ones that are overwhelming everyone with this complexity?
I think the secret, one of the big secrets of the Russian success was the infiltration of Britain. And by having all these moles in Britain, moles that potentially had access to everything, that also compromised America, because the British knew many American secrets. And I suspect after the American independence, Britain tried to flood the United States with assets, with agents. And they built these networks. And some of these networks may have become compromised by the Russians, but even these networks in America may not understand that they have been compromised.
That you're talking about interests that are connected to banking and large corporations, right?
Yeah. So it's just this thing when you're part of an old network and you believe you're working for Britain or your contact people, and you're
working for the Anglo-American,
exactly, the Anglo way of life
of companies, yeah.
Yeah, and even multi-generational networks, parents recruiting some of their children for this, and they all believe it's for the right cause, but they don't know that somewhere in Britain there's a super high-placed mole, and these secrets end up with Russia, and Russia has access to these American networks.
And Russia and China together, because China says, oh, we have all this cheap labor and we don't have environmental regulations. We can make BMWs and Mercedes and Chrysler automobiles in China.
Yeah, and so I think this was kind of the secret to the communist success, because I've looked at this from all kinds of sides, and communist intelligence, they never invented a new trick. They've always used
They inherited everything from the Okhrana.
Yeah, and they used baseline techniques, yet still they were so incredibly successful. What is the secret recipe? What is the secret sauce?
Right.
And to me, it's the failures of Britain, and by those failures of Britain, British networks, old British networks in America were also compromised. This is, I believe.
Let me suggest there's another element to the secret sauce, and it's the fact that Moscow was once under the Mongols, and the Mongol princes, the grandsons of Genghis Khan, were educated in China, and they were taught Sun Tzu, who emphasized spies.
Yeah.
That spies were the key to all. And then you had Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was the founder of the Cheka. He had a deputy named Menzinsky, right? They were Polish aristocrats. Menzinsky spoke fluent Mandarin. He loved China. He had traveled many times to China, and he was the one who thought up this Operation Trust. He was the brain behind these elaborate deception operations, which became the tradition that Lenin said, yes, do it, and Dzerzhinsky, was part of helping to provide the manpower and the organization. So you have this Oriental, this importation, because Russia, is my GRU defector friend, Colonel Stanislav Lunev, he says, Russia is not a European country. It is Asiatic. He would say that over and over again. You have to understand, and of course, he was a Mandarin-speaking Russian. He worked in China. He knew the Chinese, and he realized how much China had influenced Moscow.
Yeah, and I always tell people, in intelligence, the timeline matters so much. The time when something happens and how far something reaches back. So, for example, if you discover a breach, a break-in, a traitor, a defector, you have to actually go back and find out, when did this traitor start becoming a traitor? So you have to go back in time enough to figure out what is now compromised. And so I think for a very long time, older intelligence has been underestimated, especially in Europe. So if you look at Wiener's book on the CIA, I mean, he's this big expert, and he says there was no major intelligence agency before the 20th century. So America didn't have a proper foreign intelligence service, and in other books it says the British did not have. I read books where it says the British did not have proper intelligence, even when they had a global empire with all these colonies and they controlled India with very little personnel. Somehow they supposedly managed to do all this with no proper intelligence except a bit here and there. I mean, it's ridiculous.
It's nonsense, of course.
It's ridiculous. And of course in the past, you didn't have these singular, monolithic, bureaucratic entities to conduct intelligence.
You had aristocrats like Major Andre in America who controlled spy networks.
Yeah.
What was then the American colonies, one of which his spies was Benedict Arnold.
Exactly.
And so you definitely, and he, by the way, to make an American general into your mole, the American general who won the Battle of Saratoga, that was the battle that was credited with bringing France into the American Revolution, that man was your spy?
Yeah,
that's just, what an achievement, right?
And I strongly believe there are still some really big traitors that have not been discovered yet.
And you know how Major Andre did it? You know how he recruited Arnold?
I covered this many years ago.
Through Arnold's wife. Arnold's wife.
Yeah, I know the story.
Right. So it's really fascinating, because Sidney Riley believed women were the key to espionage.
Yeah, and there's still, I mean, remember how little money was provided for Washington's troops and everything?
Oh yeah, they were starving.
Strange sabotage from within, and all kinds of shenanigans. So you have to assume in the 13 colonies, the British had a spy network. And I think parts of the spy network even survived the revolution. And then in the expansion phase of the United States, guess what happened? Migrants from Britain and Germany, especially German territories ruled by certain aristocratic families. Now, I think today, 50 million Americans, 50 million living Americans today have at least one German ancestor. So how many spies do you think, how many spies were disguised as migrants and merchants and became American citizens? How many networks were actually built that have never been properly looked at? As I said, you have to figure out when the breach happened. And the further back the breach goes, the more problems you have. And this is not a uniquely American problem. This is also a German problem. This is a problem that Israel, even Israel has now.
Oh yeah, Israel would have that. Yeah.
It's hard to tell who is who and who has what agenda and who is.
And that's the thing, you know, when I was on the committee on the present age of China, and they had a guest speaker, and this guy, he praised the Mossad up and down, and I asked him, I said, well, what do you think is the best intelligence service in the world? Oh, the Mossad, the Mossad. And I thought to myself, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, right? Because for the same reason that you just said, when you have a country that's a polyglot, that's made from all these groups, this country is ideal for planting spies in.
Yeah. You don't have a clean place to start. You didn't have a safe place, a safe situation to start with.
Like you have Russia, which has the oldest dynasty, monarchical dynasty in the history of the world, you know, Russia. You've got England, you've got these countries that have this continuity that goes back forever and ever, you know.
I mean, in Germany today, there's almost no Jewish people who live here. I think the number is about 100,000, so you almost never meet any Jewish people here. And the only time I actually personally met several Jewish people was at a martial arts training event. Because this Israeli martial art is being taught, you know, in all these other countries. And one of my kids was in this martial arts group, and they had this big event, and you had all these people there, and you saw quite a number of Jewish people, even visiting from other countries. And what I saw was this blend of Jews and people who tended more to be Slavic. So with some people you couldn't tell out of context, you know, you couldn't tell, is this a Russian? Is this a Jewish person? And I think that became sort of an intelligence nightmare at some point. And there was this article in, I think it was the New York Times, where they were talking about these oligarchs that have become sort of an issue in the media because they're Jewish, they're sort of Russian, but you know, they move around in all these places, and who's playing for what side. And so the New York Times tried to explain this to the readers, but they couldn't really explain this because I think very few people actually can.
Well, you got the wilderness of mirrors, and you can't, if you can't, as you say, go back to this beginning and understand it from some baseline somewhere, and if you don't have a method for actually dissecting and analyzing it and then synthesizing it, you are never going to understand it.
Yeah. And so I really recommend to all people, if more people understand intelligence, they have a better chance of figuring out who is who has what agenda, who is really transparent, and you can sort of prevent these mistakes from happening, where somebody is performing tasks, you know, in intelligence or otherwise, somebody's performing tasks, he's doing what he's always done, but he's not aware of a breach in higher up. He's not aware of a mole, and he's making these mistakes without even realizing it.
So we only have a few minutes before we do 2 hours, but this has been, I think, important. So just to try to say something about this war in Ukraine now, I have noticed this shift is definitely happening. We saw the Speaker of the House of the U.S. Congress was just voted. It was unprecedented. A sitting speaker removed by his own party. You know, this does not happen in America, but it happened here. And the people that replaced him are against supporting Ukraine, against giving money. And that was one of the issues in the budget. And I'm amazed because this is it seems to me rather obvious that America does not want the Russian army on the border of NATO. coming out the other end of you. And if we don't support Ukraine, that's going to happen, right? So looking at the events in America with House Speaker McCarthy being replaced and this whole issue of Russia, and then, of course, the Poland having all of these, the breakdown of the relationship between Poland and Ukraine, which is seen in all these incidents and this bickering, this infighting between Poland and Ukraine. Do you think the Russians are on the road now with their secret networks, that they got into the war, they thought it was going to be short, but they ended up stuck, and then they engaged their networks, and now they're going to be unstuck?
Okay, so from your perspective, you're looking at American politicians. You're looking at American politicians who do exactly the wrong thing. Okay.
Yeah.
When we in Germany, if we look at our politicians who also do the wrong thing about Ukraine, there's still a whole other dimension to this, because our current chancellor the current chancellor was a flaming communist. Olaf Scholz, totally against NATO, very much pro-Eastern Bloc. When he was a young communist, he visited Soviet Eastern Germany on multiple occasions and was treated almost as if he was a head of state. Mm-hmm. So it's even way more crazy over here. When you look at a single politician. Now, of course, in America, they can have all these excuses. Oh, we're being pragmatic, whatever. There's all kinds of excuses. But over here, we have a chancellor like this. The last one, Angela Merkel, she was actually raised in communist East Germany.
East Germany, yes.
And she has this whole crazy backstory. And by the way, this backstory also touches upon old networks, which I was surprised to find. And then before her, we had a chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, who is really, really friendly with Vladimir Putin.
Well, doesn't Schröder work for the big gas company?
Yeah, he worked for the Russian energy company. When he wasn't chancellor anymore, he adopted Russian children. He was for the pipelines. He was for everything. I think he was even accused by German intelligence of ruining counterintelligence against the Russians. I think that was even a thing back then. And by the way, this Gerhard Schröder, former chancellor of Germany, he actually took legal action against a researcher who's actually very good, a man by the name of Jürgen Roth. Unfortunately, he's dead now. He warned about all of this. He warned about exactly what was going to happen 10 years, 20 years before everybody else. And so the former chancellor took legal action against one of Roth's books because of the question, when exactly did Gerhard Schröder, when exactly did he get to know Vladimir Putin, who once worked for the KGB in Eastern Germany? And Putin and some middlemen, some actual Stasi, former confirmed Stasi middlemen involved in these gas deals. When did Schröder actually meet these people in Dresden and these places? And so this author said they met earlier, and this chancellor said, no, that's not true. I'm going to take legal action against you. You mean that crazy here.
Earlier than when Putin worked in Dresden?
That's the big secret. How
would that be? That's weird. That is really weird.
Yeah, the 80s. I mean, that was especially in the 80s when
that was weird.
It was really touchy-feely between the separated parts of Germany, and so preparations were made, and then of course when the wall came down, so all these middlemen who know Putin and who know Schröder. When did Schröder meet these middlemen? And this is kind of the
Did you see one of my readers put up the very, he's like 90. He's one of the heirs to the Austrian monarchy.
Otto von Habsburg?
Yeah, Otto von Habsburg. He's giving a talk about when he first knew Putin, when he first heard the name Putin. Have you seen this this presentation that he gave
No,
in
I've
Germany?
seen a headline a few days ago.
You might look at it, and some of my readers commented on it, and it was really interesting. And I watched it. I watched his speech, and of course, he's kind of, in a way, he's kind of bragging that he kind of knew Putin before everybody else he knew, and that Putin was really very sinister and really more important than he's now betrayed. He's now portrayed as an unsuccessful KGB guy in Dresden who wasn't really that important. But Otto von Habsburg seems to say something different.
Well, the files, the surviving files, have been. I think somebody took out stuff from the Putin files because he was attached. I mean, he was KGB, but he was also attached to the East German Stasi, and so
Yes.
they had like this dual file system. And so his the Stasi files, I think, were somebody took out some stuff, and so by trying to reconstruct it, he was involved in technological espionage. So they try to figure out how the West German power system
And I
was
believe
built.
that if I recall my reading, that Putin had involvement with the Baader-Meinhof gang too. That he had them steal stereo equipment for him.
Yeah, there was
According to
involvement in left-wing circles, right-wing circles,
Yeah.
technological espionage, and then there's this weird anecdote in Catherine Belton's book on Putin's cronies, where she said one of her sources from the banking world told her the story how a young Vladimir Putin had actually visited this castle from
Yes.
the Metternich family because one of the Metternichs had married a Russian princess.
Yes, you mentioned that.
And that is the craziest anecdote I've ever heard. But
That is a crazy. Now, there's one other thing that really is troubled me, but it's like you're not supposed to say this, you're not supposed to mention it, and I'll drop this as the last bomb and get your reaction, because we talked about Hitler and Yasser Arafat and the homosexual thing, and it is the claim that Alexander Litvinenko made that Putin is a homosexual.
yeah,
And of course, there are some of my former defector contacts, former KGB guys, think that, we know Litvinenko was murdered on orders from the Kremlin. The Litvinenko trial in England kind of proved it. And people involved in that trial were murdered lately or died under strange circumstances. So we know there's a horrific trail of blood. I mean, From Russia with Blood is a British, is a book about all the murders in Great Britain. But it was really sensational and it was taken off the internet some time ago, but I read it, and Litvinenko, I was trying to get together with Litvinenko, and Litvinenko had written this thing some months before his death saying, look, when I was at the FSB in 1996, when Putin became the head of the FSB, my mentor, Colonel, I forget his name, said, oh, now the homosexuals and the child molesters are in charge of the KGB, or in charge of the FSB, because it's the FSB. And this colonel died, was murdered under strange circumstances. And the claim was that one of the claims was from another source involved with Andropov was setting up these pedophile networks in Europe, and that some kind of sexual network like this, homosexuality, pedophilia, whatever it was, that was part of what Putin was doing in East Germany, in Dresden. Have you ever heard anything like this?
Well, piecing this together from different sources, it does make sense. I mean, it's something that really needs to be looked into because, for one, I don't know exactly where I read it, but it's this narrative that Putin, he always wanted to be in the KGB. He got himself recruited, but then he was at first only used inside of Russia, which was a sign that he was not really talented, or maybe because he was gay.
Well, yeah, that's what Litvinenko said. Is he was training for the first chief directorate. They discovered he was gay, and they wouldn't let him go into the first chief directorate because of that.
Yeah, because everybody in the KGB wanted a foreign posting because it was paid better and you could live outside Russia, and
Right.
it was more, you're more in the action, and the big dream of Putin has always been to get a real foreign posting, so not Soviet East Germany but Western Germany. He wanted to infiltrate Western Germany and be this big hero. So
Mhm.
and so, I mean, if we assume that he was discovered, and I remember some details, I don't know from where, in during these training missions in Russia, there was this one apartment that was rigged with cameras, hidden cameras, and somehow Putin was discovered as gay in that narrative, and he later tried to clean the archives and remove all incriminating stuff.
Mhm.
So then he gets posted in Dresden, which is a safe territory for a spy because it was, occupied part of Germany. And so he starts running operations. And first of all, if he was if he was running operations that had a pedophile nature, and there's some indications in newer research actually, Putin was suspected. I'm going from memory here. Putin, I can look this up for
Mhm.
next week. Supposedly, Putin was running assets in West Germany, some ultra right wingers, and there's at least one mention that some of these neo-Nazis that he was running were involved in underage prostitution.
Mm.
And there was one guy who was a criminal, and there were underage victims, and he was protected by intelligence. So there are indications. There are indications of that, and I mean, if the Stasi was more in on it, and this was not exclusively run by the KGB, if the Stasi was in on it, who has these missing pages in Putin's files?
Mhm.
Because stuff was removed, certainly, and of course, even in the decades before Putin's service, there were these older networks here, even occult groups here, and traditionally, even groups such as the OTO or the Golden Dawn, they were
Mhm.
extensively used for espionage purposes. I mean,
Yes, that's correct.
I
Yeah.
read this recent paper from I think it was a professor from Idaho, and he wrote that Aleister Crowley was a British spy, and he
Right.
infiltrated the
Yes.
OTO and infiltrated the Golden Dawn. And I think the OTO was originally an Austrian or German creation for spying purposes. So
Mhm.
they had
The
these
order OTA is the Order Templar
Templi Orientis, exactly.
Entius Orientis. Yes.
So
Right.
so basically, some crazy Austrians or some crazy Germans, they create an occultist organization, including sex magic and all that, and they start recruiting people and they expand into other territories and countries. So there's all kinds of activity
Mhm.
on German territory, and there's always been this kind of activity going on. So it's
Mm.
always been used for espionage, and it was just a way to reward assets and incriminate assets and control assets.
And illicit sex becomes a tool for
Yeah.
compromising and blackmailing and
Yeah, I mean, we talked about earlier, we talked about how for the longest time, homosexuals, they have their own world, they have their own codes, they have their own language and their own circles. And
so would occultists, especially 100 plus years ago when most everybody was a Christian, and to be an occultist
yeah,
was to you better hide it under your hat, right?
exactly. So occultists had their own thing, and even pedophiles have their own world. So
Hmm.
they view themselves as kind of it's a group of their own, and nobody else understands them, and nobody else can be privy to their secrets and whatnot. So if this actually, if communism is merged with occultism and pedophilia, it's a very explosive mix. And I've recently, a couple of days ago, I did a text on occultism linked with intelligence work and revolutionary movements, because especially before a revolutionary happens, in the preparatory phase, you see a lot of occult activity. And this was the same with the communists. I mean, the earlier communists before the revolution, they were crazy as heck. I mean, they were occultists all over. And this was in preparation for this operation they were planning.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, thank you, Alex. And this is Jeff Nyquist, and I want to thank everybody for joining this. This has been 2 hours and 14 minutes, but I tell you, I just don't want to stop. So we'll continue next week, and we'll do more. And there'll be a transcript available of this. You usually post it on your site. Why don't you give your site information?
The website is candorintel.com, and you can find the transcripts and additional material on all kinds of topics.
All right.